hear so much about China in the news these days, from the undervalued currency to Google pulling its search engine out of China and putting it into Hong Kong. American companies are complaining it's harder to do business there. China is stealing American jobs, we hear. We hear about toxic drywall. There are 4 class action lawsuits here in the state of Florida for toxic drywall in people's homes. China is in the news today for very good reasons. This year, I believe, is a turning point in China's relationship with the rest of the world and in its own economic model. China is moving out of a model where it's dependent on low value-added exports into a phase of its development where domestic consumption, high value-added exports, and innovation matter much more. And it's important for another reason. I believe that no country is more important to our economic future here in America than China. Not only does China make most of the goods that we buy, most of the consumer goods, 1 in 5 American imports are from China. But it's also a giant market, as someone pointed out, for American companies. China is the leading buyer of many commodities. Its environmental policies, as was also noted, influence the entire climate change debate. And its influence is only growing. I've been living in China and in Hong Kong for the last decade, most of the last decade. And I've been writing about it for that entire time. I started as a Financial Times correspondent covering China. I then wrote a book about Chinese factories called The China Price. And today I work as a consultant and as an academic. And as John said, I spend a lot of time talking to people on the ground, everyone from factory workers to factory managers to policymakers, government officials. Over the last few years in particular, I've come to believe that to understand America's future, we must understand first what is happening on the ground in China. Over the next 15 minutes, I'd like to share with you a few of the conclusions that I've drawn from my research and how these issues that I've discovered about China relate to our future here in America. And then I'd like to open up briefly to some questions to continue the conversation that we just started. So I'd like to start with a story. Around this time last year, one of the committees in Congress that looks at China called me and asked me to come and testify about China's role in the global financial crisis. In particular, they wanted to assign blame to China for triggering the financial crisis. So I decided that the best way I could answer that question about what China's role was in the financial crisis was to go to the Chinese countryside, where real Chinese people live, where most Chinese people live. So I went up into the hills in eastern China in Jiangxi province. And this was over Chinese New Year, which is like China's Christmas, when most people come home and spend the holidays with their family. At that time, there were 23 million Chinese workers out of a job as a direct result of Americans spending less time at Walmart. There was a feeling among Chinese policymakers and among American policymakers that these Chinese workers were angry and that they were about to take to the streets and protest the fact that this global financial crisis had caused them to lose their jobs. So I went around to everyone I met in the countryside. I was staying with a family there, and I asked them the same question. Are you angry? And they looked at me like I was a total idiot. And so I walked them through the logic. Americans stop shopping, you lose your job, it's China's fault, isn't it, that we're in the global financial crisis? And they looked at me and they walked me through their own logic. They said, the financial crisis began in America, with the banks in America and the real estate market there. Then China has been affected by that. We have lost our jobs, but we don't blame the Chinese government for that. It's our responsibility to find jobs. We're used to this kind of uncertainty, and the Chinese government is doing the best it can to help us find jobs. Their comments reflected a sentiment that I have seen increasingly frequently in China since then, and that is, and this is my first conclusion that I'd like to share with you today, China feels that the global financial crisis has proved that its economic model is superior to the West's, and that moving forward, that it has particular elements of its system that make it better able to survive these kind of shocks. We've already started to see some examples of this new confidence in some of China's statements. If you talk to foreign companies working in China today, they'll tell you that there is a apparent crackdown on foreign companies for tax evasion. That's probably fair enough. A lot of Chinese and foreign companies try to evade taxes in China like every other country. There is a policy that they complain about called indigenous innovation. And this is essentially a policy that the Chinese government is trying to favor domestically developed technologies in their government procurement. A lot of companies, foreign companies, feel that this indigenous innovation policy is making it harder for them to compete. Recently, there was a fascinating investigation by a local government in eastern China into luxury brands sold in China, foreign luxury brands, Louis Vuitton, Hermes. And what they found is that a lot of these luxury brands were selling products that the Chinese government announced publicly were of inferior quality. So they were accusing Hermes of putting out junk into the Chinese market. These moves, plus Google's latest decision, have made it a lot easier for foreign companies to criticize what they feel is a difficult, increasingly difficult operating environment in China. None of this is more than talk, really, yet. But I believe it's the start of an era where we see more clashes, where China feels that it's right to put its position forward and it's more confident on the international stage, and that it doesn't need foreign investors as much as it used to. Part of the reason for this, I believe, is that China feels it's been unfairly criticized by the West. With unemployment here in the US near 10%, one of the arguments that politicians and think tanks and unions are making is that China is to blame for America's unemployment problem. Particularly that China's undervaluation of its currency is the reason that so many people in America are struggling to find work. And I'm sure you all have heard economists argue that China's currency is undervalued by 20 to 40%. The Economic Policy Institute found that 2.4 million American jobs had been lost or displaced by China since 2001. Now, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to make an argument about how much the renminbi is undervalued by, or for that matter, how many jobs have actually been lost. But I would respectfully disagree with the concept that China is to blame for America's unemployment problem. Absolutely, American manufacturing workers did lose their jobs in greater numbers than any other category of workers in America except for construction workers over the last 2 years. But most of these jobs did not go to China. In fact, most of the jobs that China has gained in recent years have been from other developing countries, like Mexico, Indonesia, Thailand. And that is the second point I want to leave you with today. China is not to blame for America's unemployment problem. Even if China appreciated its currency overnight, tomorrow we had a 5–10% increase in the value of the renminbi, we are not going to be creating jobs as a result of that in America. I'll give you 3 reasons why I think this is the case. The first reason is that the entire supply chain for many industries has migrated to China. Half of the world's microwaves are made in China. Almost all of the, if not all of the iPods are made in China. The reason for this is because of industrial clusters. Basically, everything you need to make an iPod is located within 2 hours of one city in southern China. And the same applies to countless other consumer goods. So those industrial clusters are very difficult to compete with, regardless of the level of your currency. The second point is that China's competitive advantage, as a result of the last 10 years, 20 years of building up those industrial clusters, and of course with the help of an undervalued currency, is now so deep and so entrenched that it's very difficult to move that manufacturing to another country. Manufacturing is sticky. People don't want to move their factory across the street, much less to another country. It takes them a long time to make that decision. The third reason is that China is the world's biggest, other than India, is the world's biggest growth market. It's the largest car market in the world. Airplane manufacturers are in China producing more of their parts in China now because they want to be in good with the Chinese government. They don't want to be producing parts outside of China so that the Chinese government can say, well, you're not producing enough parts here, why should we buy a lot of your airplanes for our airlines? What has happened over the last year is that China has turned the Great Recession into the Great Opportunity. China's market share of US imports went from 15% before the global financial crisis to 19% after the crisis. And for all of the reasons I just explained to you, the industrial clusters, the deepening competitive advantage, the fast-growing market, there are very good reasons why China should appreciate its currency. But appreciation is not going to solve America's unemployment problem. Here in America, we tend to think of, when we think of the Made in China brand, we think of toys, shoes, clothing. And Chinese factories do make, well, factories in China do make a lot of those products. In fact, more than any other country in terms of what we import. But China's largest category of exports to the United States is not toys, shoes, or clothing. It's electronics and equipment. Last year, we imported $105 billion worth of electronics and equipment from China. We only imported $25 billion worth of clothing. So that statistic gives you a sense of where we're going. Electronics, equipment, higher value-added products are where China wants to go. Doesn't want to be the world's sweatshop anymore. Another direction Beijing is trying to reposition its export sector is away from relying on foreign companies. When I first started looking into China's export sector, I was very surprised to find that more than half of China's exports are made by foreign companies, not by Chinese companies. So when you think of your iPod, you think made in China must be made by a Chinese company. Actually, it's made by a Taiwanese company called Foxconn. And that is technically a foreign investor from China's perspective. There are lots of Chinese companies making, Chinese factories doing exports, but the reality is that oftentimes the labor may be Chinese, but the capital is foreign. And China would like to change that. It wants to be producing more of those things itself, and it wants to be moving up the value chain. Another change that China is trying to make in its export profile is that it's trying to make its exports more profitable. It might seem like China is making a lot of money from producing that huge volume of goods for America, but the reality is that we in America are getting a lot better deal out of Chinese factories than China is out of those same factories. The reason is that there are too many factories in most industries in China. Most consumer goods factories, most consumer goods industries are plagued by overcapacity. So that means that if Walmart or Dollar General comes to China and they don't like the price that one factory offers them, they can just go down the road and get a cheaper price from another factory. That has driven down margins to very, very slim levels for most Chinese exporters. Retailers and brands make a much bigger profit margin out of Chinese factories than those factories do themselves. China knows this. It also is aware that its labor market is turning against it. And what I mean by that is that even though China's population is huge, 1.3 billion people, because of its one-child policy that it introduced in 1979, while the whole workforce will continue to grow until 2015, the population of people between the ages of 15 and 19, which is when you typically start working in a Chinese export factory, peaked in 2005. In economics, this is called the Lewisian turning point. It means that after that point, wages start to go up very quickly. The population of people between the ages of 15 and 24 has just peaked. So if you think about the people who came into these factories, typically they're people who come from the Chinese countryside and come into the cities right after they finish junior high school or maybe a little later. And those people will work through their early 20s in these factories, and then they might go back home to the countryside, have a kid, and then maybe probably come back out to the cities. That migration from farm to factory in China is the largest migration in human history. And that migration, that flood of people, is starting to slow. So what does all this mean for China's manufacturing sector? It means that China must generate more profit per worker, because wages, one of the components of the cost of making goods in China, are going up. So that's my third conclusion, which is that China no longer wants to be a manufacturer of just low-end goods. It wants to be doing research and development, product design. It wants to be doing the innovation itself and grab more of that profit that Apple and other foreign brands are making in China. Over the last decade, China has been increasing its investment in research and development faster than any other major country. For the last decade, it's been increasing its research and development investment by 20% a year. Last year, it spent $70 billion on R&D. In certain areas, like energy technology, it's increasing even faster than 20%. Energy technology investment in R&D went up 50 times last year. At the same time, foreign companies are also doing more of their R&D in China. 30% of the R&D in high tech is done by foreign companies in China. Why are they doing this? One, because labor is cheaper. The cost of a silicon chip designer in China is 10 to 20% of the wage of a similar silicon chip designer in Silicon Valley. Not 10 to 20% less, 10 to 20% of that wage. It's a huge discount. The other issue is what I said before. China is the world's fastest growing big market for a lot of these companies. They want to be doing their R&D on the ground in China. One of my closest friends and wealthiest friends in China is an Irishman named Liam Casey. Liam has started a company about a decade ago to do design for foreign companies in China, product design. And then he outsources the manufacturing to a factory in China. And so he'll have a team of 10 Chinese engineers led by one French engineer based in the city of Shenzhen. And that one French engineer will oversee this team designing printers or printer cartridges, computer cables, all sorts of electronic products. And he works with the biggest brands in the world. And Liam Casey is their favorite person because he is basically allowing them to outsource their R&D to other countries, to China specifically. People often ask me whether China can innovate. And my answer is that China is already innovating, and we're helping China do it. Last few weeks, we've seen a lot of coverage of Google and the censorship in the Chinese internet. This reminded me of the coverage of China during the financial crisis. If we remember, a lot of the comments from even American executives is that if you want to see a shovel-ready country, China is shovel-ready. That's the CEO of Caterpillar. People were just marveling at China's ability to get things done. The impression I got was that from reading these things, that Beijing was like a giant orchestra conductor. And it would cue the violins of the steel sector, and they would, all of a sudden produce more steel, and cue the auto sector, and China would produce a global brand. That was the impression that you would get reading some of the coverage of China. I'm here to tell you what Beijing knows but would never admit, and that is that China cannot control everything and everyone in China. China is a much more chaotic and diverse place than it seems from afar. The myth of China having control over everything does have a kernel of truth, like a lot of myths. China's leaders do have more controls, more levers to control their economy. They have state-owned banks. They have investments in all of the key industries: autos, steel, oil, telecommunications, banking. China obviously manipulates its currency, we know that. And it monitors the internet, as we've discovered recently. But it's much more chaotic. There is not one Chinese government. There are many levels of Chinese government. And there are a lot of people trying to get rich at once. Very briefly, I'll tell you a story about that really made me feel that China didn't have control over everything. It's about the coal sector. A couple years ago, I went up into coal country in China, and I spent some time there with a coal miner. We'll call him Joe. And Joe worked by day in a state-owned coal mine, and he wanted to send his son to university in the United States. So he decided on the weekends he would open his own coal mine. And so he went up higher into the hills, and he opened a very small coal mine and employed about 6 people. And I went up to see them, and I asked them, well, how does this work? China has about 24,000 coal mines. Most of those are actually small coal mines. Many of them are illegal. China wants and has been trying for the last 10 years to consolidate the coal mining sector. But it struggles to do that because of guys like Joe. The reason it wants to consolidate it is because there are so many coal mining accidents. We had one here in the US this week, but we've had a ton in China recently, several in China. It also wants to be able to control the sector better so it can control the prices for coal and energy and have better grasp on that. Anyway, so Joe, I went up to see him and I asked him how it works, and he said, well, I've got a good friend in the local government, and I pay him a little money on the side, and so when they're going to come and do an inspection and try to shut down all the coal mines up here, I get a call, and I tell my workers not to come in that day. So the day the inspectors come, the government alerts him and tells him not to open the mine, and so he never gets caught. And when I went to see these miners, I interviewed them, and you'd think they would be scared of, I didn't understand why they would be scared to talk to me, but I realized the reason they're scared to talk to me is they're terrified of losing their jobs. They desperately want to keep that coal mine open. So when I interviewed them, I asked them what their names were, and they were terrified. They said their names were yogurt and milk. China produces 30% of the world's coal and 80% of the world's coal mining deaths. So there is a great incentive for China to clean up this sector, but what I'm trying to say is that there is not the exhaustive and complete control over everything that it might seem from afar. There are lots of examples where China's efforts to try to consolidate or pick winners in certain sectors have not worked. China's government is not a monolith, it's not omniscient. There are many parts of the Chinese government, many people in China, and they don't always agree. Two very quick points I'll make before I close is that China, in its next phase of development, as I explained, is going to need a lot more expertise in areas that it hasn't had before. As it tries to move into the higher value-added, less resource-intensive exports, and as it tries to build global brands, to design more of its products, it's going to need expertise in areas that it hasn't needed it before, including branding, human resources management, organizational change, product design. The problem is there aren't that many people in China who have a lot of experience doing all those things. Every year, China produces 350,000 engineering graduates with at least an undergraduate degree, compared to 140,000 here in the US. But less than 10% of those Chinese graduates are up to the standards of multinational companies. That's not my view, that's McKinsey Global Institute, part of McKinsey. And that brings me to my final point. China is going to need American expertise. And there are opportunities for us here in that. It's not just in the areas I've talked about. Think about healthcare, where China has its own healthcare reform package that it's trying to overhaul its healthcare system. Despite all of the debate over the last few months and the criticism of the American system, we do have the most advanced medical system in the world. We know how to manage hospitals more efficiently. To be seen by a reputable doctor in China, you have to often get to the hospital at dawn and wait until you can register to see the doctor. Doctors, I've seen pictures of doctors wearing military helmets to protect themselves from angry family members of patients who are upset about the treatment. So in the future, the China price, which in my book I refer to as the heavy price that China and the rest of the world have paid for China's success as a global manufacturing giant, the China price may in the future refer to the high salaries that China is paying foreign experts in these areas to help advise it on how to reform healthcare, how to build global brands, how to do product design. Already, I know several scientists in the United States who are setting up their labs in China. So in conclusion, I think the issues that this leaves us to contemplate are three. First, I believe we need to stop blaming China for our own economic problems. China is a very convenient foil for politicians, but the issues we're facing creating jobs after the downturn are ours alone. To me, this must include two elements. One, we need to look at our political system and our legal systems to make sure we haven't tied ourselves up in knots that hinder our competitiveness. I hear constantly from business people in China, American business people, that American laws and policies on certain issues have brought them to China, have driven them to China. We want to make sure that what we're doing is making ourselves more competitive with our legal and political systems. Second, we need to make sure we're continuing to attract the best talent. UCF is a great example of how universities here draw people from around the world, and that is the kind of a competitive advantage that we need to protect. And finally, and I think fittingly, given the setting, we need to invest more in education. Right now, there are more people in China studying English than the entire population of the United States. More Chinese graduates of undergraduate universities are going on to get PhDs and masters in America and other countries. These are the people that we are competing with and in which we can see a business opportunity. So with that, I'll open up the floor to you. Thank you very much.
As a result of the one-child policy and the farm-to-factory migration, there are issues of elder care in China and a dearth of care and services. Could you address that?
China's aging population presents a challenge economically, but also an opportunity for people who understand geriatric care. What's happening if you go to the Chinese countryside now, because of the one-child policy, the people left in the countryside in China, in many villages, are just old people and babies. And so we have a real issue to address in healthcare, bringing more hospitals out to rural areas and clinics, improving the quality of the doctors there, and improving the quality of the medicines that are available. 1 in 3 medicines in Chinese hospitals, public hospitals, are counterfeit. And so we need to make sure that as China will need to make sure that as it addresses its healthcare reform, that rural healthcare is at the top of its agenda. Historically, urban areas have gotten much better healthcare. And given that 800 to 900 million people live in the Chinese countryside, we need to make sure that the countryside, as you point out, where so many elderly and young people live, is at the top of their agenda.
In 2007, the sense was that one of China's biggest problems is being able to feed their people due to the agrarian situation in that country. Would you comment on that, please?
One of the issues that I've been doing a bit of research in is food safety, an issue that obviously all of us care about, making sure that what we're buying from China is as safe as it can possibly be. What I found is that the biggest food safety issue in China is not in the exports, it's in the domestic market. That most of the food safety scandals happen within the domestic supply. But as the plot size goes down, the big difference between China's agricultural sector and our agricultural sector here is that China's agricultural sector is not industrialized. We don't have giant factory farms in China the way we do here in the United States. And the plot size is very small. In a lot of areas, government has appropriated land to build shopping malls and other developments that take away from arable land. One of the amusing sort of trivial facts that I've discovered is that China has a moratorium on golf course development for the same reason. A lot of these local government officials think, I like golf. Golf is profitable, golf is high-end, we can build a hotel, we can build a golf course, and they appropriate local residents' farming land to build a golf course. So officially, at least, golf courses there's a moratorium on development. But if you ask any of the golf course designers in the world where are they building most of their golf courses, they'll tell you it's in China, despite the moratorium. So it's a great issue that you raise. I think the issue will be how does China make it, sort of consolidate these farms in a profitable way. And I think that is an opportunity for some American companies that are involved in agriculture.
There's been a very steep rise in the cost of housing. Do you think that this is going to result in something like it happened in the United States?
That's a very hotly debated issue among economists and Chinese government officials. One of the key differences between China's property bubbles and American or Japanese property bubbles is that most Chinese don't buy their homes with mortgages. Mortgage reliance on banks is much lower. So you have less of that issue in China. But one of the other issues related to China's housing bubble or housing, the soaring housing prices in China is that many people are unable to afford homes in urban areas. When you talk to ordinary Chinese who are moving into the cities, it's increasingly an issue for them about where they're going to live. In the Chinese press in the last few weeks, there have been a number of cases where the Chinese press have focused on people in very wealthy cities who are living in shipping containers, for example, next to big highways, because those shipping containers are much more affordable, obviously, than actually living in a building. So there is a lot of concern about building affordable housing. And we've seen the Chinese government is trying to respond by encouraging developers to build middle and low-income housing. But I think that there is an issue with affordability and, of course, with the impact on the rest of the economy. But perhaps China will have multiple bubbles that deflate without it affecting the entire banking system and the rest of the economy the way we've seen elsewhere.
I would just wonder about Hong Kong's position. I know it's still to a large extent a great entrepot for China. Do you see that changing in any way?
Thank you for asking a question about my adopted hometown in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is going through an identity crisis. It is very concerned about its waning relevance within China because of the rise of Shanghai in particular, but also because of the rise of Singapore as a financial market. Singapore is doing a great job of attracting a lot of the hedge funds and other investors to set up there with all sorts of incentives. Hong Kong still has a very important role within China as a financial center, an offshore financial center. Its currency is convertible, unlike the renminbi, fully convertible. And it's increasingly a place where mainland investors can come and buy homes and shop. But its significance as a port has waned considerably with the rise of Shenzhen, partly because of investment by Hong Kong companies in the Shenzhen port just across the border. Its significance as a financial center remains, but is under question because of the growth of Shanghai. And obviously that depends on whether the renminbi is made fully convertible, and that's a long-term question. But Hong Kong is struggling and struggling at a 4 to 5% growth, so it's not shrinking. But it feels that it is no longer significant, as significant as it used to be. So I think that's probably a natural development that as particularly the southern China region, the Pearl River Delta around Hong Kong develops, and as Shanghai rises, that Hong Kong will need to reconsider what its role, its proper value add is within China and the global economy.
Why is China so upset that Google left? They have the technology to build a search engine, and they have no concern about patent law.
I'm not sure if I would say that China is upset, but the Google case didn't present China in the way that it likes to be presented as a forward-looking, innovation-focused, creative, high-value-added economy. That's what China would like to show. That's the face that China would like to show to the world. And this Google's decision to raise the issue of censorship on an international stage has called its bluff, in a sense. It said, these issues, we disagree with the way you're handling these issues. We disagree so much that we're willing to sacrifice our business in China to do that. So China, of course, has its own search engine, Baidu, which has a bigger market share for search than Google did. But I think it's more on a PR level. I think it presented a challenge to the Chinese government to respond in a way that it would present it in the best possible light internationally. But China has its view of the world, and I think it will feel increasingly comfortable expressing that.
What is the debate between personal responsibility and then corporate responsibility for jobs in China, and how does that affect the economy?
Among those migrant workers that I talked about, the people living in the countryside, and that's about 200 million people, they have been accustomed to taking personal responsibility for finding jobs on their own. They don't know it any other way, and they don't expect any handout from the government because there really has never been a handout from the government for them. So what I was struck by in talking to them about this a year ago, and I continue these conversations with a lot of these migrant workers today, is that in an economy growing at 10% a year or 8.7% a year, there are a lot of job opportunities. It's true that a lot of university graduates in China struggle to find jobs, but that's more of a that's a different labor market from what these migrant workers who have junior high school educations are operating in. In southern China right now, there is a labor shortage. And of course, in a country that big and in any market, there's never actually a labor shortage. There's just a labor shortage at a certain wage. And that relates to your question of housing, because it's so expensive to live in the cities that these workers are not moving to those cities anymore. And there are more factories in inland areas. But I think that most people don't perceive that corporations have any responsibility to them. That even in a place like Hong Kong, turnover is very high. At these factories, some of the factories I know well, turnover is 100% a year. You lose the entire workforce every year. And that's because there's a lot of opportunity at other places, and because those factories are not very good at human resources management. And they don't really know how to retain their workforce for more than a year.
I feel that I don't know enough about what's going on with the pollution issues and the clean water, and I don't really know how to ask the question. What are your thoughts, and what have you heard, and what do you know?
Around 2008, China started to get much more concerned about this pollution issue and started to crack down, especially in certain areas, export areas like southern China, on polluting companies. It became increasingly difficult to set up a new factory that was polluting, and it was a much more widely covered issue in the Chinese press. The global financial crisis made China put the brakes on that plan for a little while. That was my impression talking to business people, was that the environment took a back seat to creating jobs, making sure that people had jobs. And so there wasn't as strict an environmental inspection going on for these polluting factories. But I think that momentum will pick up again because pollution is increasingly an issue of concern to ordinary Chinese. There have been cases where very well-connected cell phone toting residents of cities like Xiamen, which is on the coast right across from Taiwan in China, that people gathered to protest a chemical plant that they were building there. They said, we don't want this kind of polluting enterprise in our city. And so the government postponed that plan, shelved it for a while. So there is a growing environmental awareness among Chinese, and I think certainly for the Chinese government. There is also a huge investment in things like solar power, wind power, so much investment, in fact, that now there's overcapacity in wind turbine makers in China. Solar panels, a similar case. Basically, everybody wants to invest in the same sector. So China is making great strides in terms of actually the production of that, but there is a long way to go on cleaning up water supply, cleaning up the air, and that is going to be a multi-decade issue for them to address.
Into China and dealing directly with the Chinese government, especially since there are many dichotomies and many things that cultural differences.
Yes. Well, step one, move to China. If that's not an option, pay somebody else to move to China. Step two, pay them to learn Chinese. If you can't, communicate with your interlocutors in their own languages, in their own language, then you are at a significant disadvantage in China, in my opinion. If you can't read the local news, if you can't gather those additional details on the ground, then you potentially miss a real trick. In my book, I tell the story of a guy called Eugene, who he supplies Walmart. He has a factory, and Walmart has a rule that says, we have a code of conduct that says you have to follow the Chinese law, and you have to make sure that you're not using slave labor or child labor. But we also want our products for a very low price. And so Eugene, when he started supplying Walmart, asked a couple other factory managers, well, what do you do? How do you have this beautiful factory and make things for this really low price? So they all told him exactly what to do, and he followed their advice. He went and he created 2 sets of time cards. One was the one that he showed Walmart. It was followed all the laws in China and looked perfect. And then the other was the real one, and that showed that his workers were working around the clock, 7-day weeks, unsafe conditions. And he hid the real ones and only showed Walmart the fake ones. Walmart bought it, hook, line, and sinker. But still Eugene was unhappy. He felt maybe they were going to find the real ones if they sniffed around. So he asked around his friends again, and they told him, don't bother with the fake time cards. We have another method now. And that method is not fake time cards, but a fake factory. So Walmart would come to his factory, and I went along with the Walmart inspector, follows all the laws, looks like a perfect Chinese factory, a model factory. In fact, that's what he calls it. He calls it his 5-star factory. Down the road was the real factory, which was producing 60% of the product for Walmart. And there they were working around the clock. If the government inspectors turned up, they would lock the door. They would tell you, the employees wouldn't tell you where they worked. They'd say they were unemployed. Walmart never asked about that other factory, never even tried to look for that other factory. If you had spent 5 minutes talking to motorcycle drivers in the neighborhood, you would know that there were actually 2 factories, that Eugene had 2 factories. But you have to be able to know the local market to know that. So his 5-star factory and the shadow factory are widely known in China. Some people estimate that most factories in China have a shadow factory, like the one around the corner. But the only way you find that out is by talking to people in their local language on the ground. So that would be my 2 pieces of advice. Send someone there, learn the language, and sniff around.
The work of this center now has expanded into about 75 countries around the world. We work very extensively on training government and corporate people on how to secure advanced technology and products that have both weapons applications, and by that I mean nuclear weapons, chemical, bioweapons, missiles, aerospace, as well as commercial applications. So I work very much on the front lines with governments and corporations around the world. So what you get from me is a very practitioners-oriented perspective, somewhat complementing what Alex said in terms of working on the ground in China. I have probably provided training on the ground in China in well over 50 events to more than 80% of people who regulate these things in China. And the same is true for India, where I worked with the highest levels of foreign policy, national security leadership, all the way to the Prime Minister's office in significant engagement going back about 20 years. So what I'm going to do is, I had some idea of what Alex was going to talk about, so I have built some of my remarks that resonate and pick up on the themes that she was talking about in China, but also, obviously, the focus is on India. Let me start with a joke then, or it's a true story. One day at Maxwell Air Force Base, a friend of mine who was then teaching at Harvard and then went back to Tel Aviv, he was asked to do a briefing for the State Department on the Middle East relationship. And he said, how much time do I have? And they said, 8 or 10 minutes. And he said, really, I cannot do it in that much. I need more time. They said, okay, we'll give you one word to just sum it up. And he said, okay, in that case, the word is good. And that didn't make sense to them. So they said, okay, we give you 2 words. And he said, not good. These countries that we are looking at this morning, China, India, and how they relate to the United States, are really complex, diverse countries. What you heard from Alex is a fairly granulated, very informative, and very accurate assessment of the dynamics within the Chinese market. I will zoom out a little bit first and tell you what is happening in India as well as in China, and how does Washington, what are the strategic drivers that frame Washington's relationship with these 2 capitals, and why do we care? Why should we care about what's happening in these markets, not just the details of these markets? In other words, why was all this cooperation not happening, say, 20 years ago? What has changed? Okay, so I'll give you that bigger picture as well as the details of the Indian economic liberalization, its own market, how it compares with and contrasts with China and so on. Okay, but I'll have a bit of security as well on it. It would have been embarrassing if I couldn't operate a simple technology when I teach high technology, isn't it? I threw in this little map to give you an idea of where India is, I understand you have a large and successful Vibrant India program, so you would know that. But take a look at the top part. First of all, when you look at India, it is the only country in South Asia that has land or sea borders with all the other 7 countries in South Asia. And up at the top in Kashmir, you will see a portion that's controlled by Pakistan, and a small portion, I mean, a large portion of China, Kashmir, that's controlled by China, which includes a piece that Pakistan leased to China back in 1963. And that land border has become a conduit through the Karakoram Highway, the K2 highway, for China to build a all-weather 4-lane highway that takes Chinese soldiers all the way through Pakistani territory into the northwest frontier province, which is in the news these days because of all the terrorist attacks that you see there. But China is building in the port city of Gwadar a deep sea port where naval submarines and others can berth there. And when that is completed, from there Chinese ships berthed in that port in about half a day of travel will reach the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, and into the Iranian waters. So in other words, bypassing the entire South China Sea, Bay of Bengal, Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and then out there, this entire journey is obviated, and China has a direct access to influence through its presence, outcomes in the Persian Gulf. This is something that the Soviets were trying with the Afghanistan occupation back 20 years ago and never did. But the Chinese have found a beautiful way to do this while building the railroad links inside of Pakistan. All right. Now, what I've done is, since it's such a large story, I've just divided it into the last 3 presidencies: President Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And the black letters that you see is US policy in those presidents' terms vis-a-vis India, and regarding China in the red, just to give you a sort of contrasting picture of how things were evolving with China as well. During the Clinton term, India was identified as one of the top 10 big emerging markets, and so the big Clinton push for expanding their engagement in India, opening up the Indian market, all of those initiatives that flew out of there. This is 1995. 96 to 98 is the period characterized by the debate on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that Clinton administration brought to, well, it was then debated first at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and then brought to the UN General Assembly and adopted through signatures. We could not get, we meaning in Washington here, get that treaty ratified by the Senate. It still hasn't been. But India, which was one of the proponents and co-drafter of that legislation at the CD in Geneva, was forced through a demand by Australia and China through what is called an entry into force, which required India to sign it, which it couldn't have done at that time because it hadn't tested its weapons except for once in 1974. So India stood out of it because it needed unanimous vote. It had to go back to the UN General Assembly, and it was adopted for signature. But that created a rift in Clinton and India's engagement, followed by the Indian nuclear tests in 98 actually. A series of sanctions, and then a dialogue process that lifted most of those sanctions, and then began a different process of engagement, heavier on the security side, but also continuing with the economic engagement that was going on. They also set up a working group on counterterrorism, and that had met 3 times and worked well before 9/11, and then that really got ramped up under the Bush term. Around the same time in the Clinton administration regarding China, as you heard from Alex, economic engagement was a very big issue. At that time, there used to be annual heated debates in the Congress on PNTR, the Permanent Normal Trading Relationship with China. And then ultimately, Washington supported China's entry into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. China then became a crucial player in our trying to solve the North Korea problem. DPRK stands for Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which, if I may say so, is neither democratic nor people's nor a republic. But Washington, while it tries to lead that effort, it is anchored very heavily by Beijing, and that Beijing sees as one of its claims to global negotiating position. And it calibrates its assistance to that program, as well as assistance to the DPRK regime in Pyongyang to sustain that crisis in some ways. And then we had, in Washington, tried to provide financial incentives to Russia, Ukraine, and China to walk away from or de-emphasize their missile program. And because we had a shortage of commercial communication satellites, we decided we will pay these countries to launch our satellites. And so they started doing that. And in China in '96, there was a big failure of a Long March rocket that was taking our commercial satellites. And that led to an investigation. Two of our companies that had built the satellites provided technology which Washington then determined had enough of information on propulsion and guidance systems, which would also help Beijing improve its missile guidance systems. And so that led to a very, very heavy sanction, 10 years of debate in the Congress and all of that. So that's the sort of relationship with China going forward. Excuse me. I need to keep my hands to myself. Under President Bush, with whom I've worked, or not with whom directly, although, but very closely, he fundamentally believed that Washington needs to reassess its post-Cold War policy and build stable strategic allies. Asia is most important because more than 45–50% of global investable capital is in Asia. Most of it is now actually in China and in India. In fact, while I'm on that subject, I'll come back to this theme in a second. But given all of this, he was looking at India as a country that would be extremely vital for Washington to engage very closely. And so he built a number of these engagements on counterterrorism, on high technology cooperation group that's still going on. We had a meeting last week in Washington. And the July 2005 agreement, which basically had 4 components, as you see up on the slide. Civil nuclear deal was the biggest piece of it. I've worked extensively on it, so I'll be happy to answer your questions on that. But this was a very big piece because it allowed for the first time after 30 years of Indian nuclear tests in '74 for India to come out from being out in the cold into the mainstream. Can you still hear me if I step back? I need to come closer. All right. I need to stop moving my hands. So anyway, a big deal, a nuclear deal was crafted over 4 years. It ended up amending some of Washington's laws and that of Nuclear Suppliers Group. This is a group of 45 countries. And essentially what it did was India was able to keep its weapons complex separate, and island and firewall it. And all the rest of India, 90% of India and its nuclear facilities are now open for international investment, reactors, fuel, everything. It's a very large market for Washington and for other countries. It's slated to be at least $30 billion market in the next 20 years alone. And US companies are now moving in to build their reactors. Civilian space, we've had enormous cooperation happening, building on India's own very successful satellite program. And their lunar mission to Moon a year and a half ago. Washington reversed 30 years of policy and actually sent some experimental payloads on that. So they jointly conducted some experiments on the Moon and so on. Missile defense, other kinds of issues. But I'm going to get to the economic side in a minute. The fundamental point here is the assisting in military capabilities, where Washington believed that ramping up India's military capabilities will fundamentally assist in US strategic calculations to maintain its most important presence in the Asia-Pacific region. In other words, India as a partner in not only areas of peacekeeping, search and rescue, maritime security, escort to cargo, fuel supplies, all of those things, but fundamentally also creating joint capabilities to intervene in regional crises and other kinds of situations if the need came. And to, if you'll forgive a pompous-sounding phrase that I use, to circumscribe the latitude and propensity of unilateral behavior from Beijing. In case things went south with Beijing, you will have at least the capacities to circumscribe that. All right. Now, with China, things got off to a rough start with the EP-3 spy plane incident from Hainan Island. We just met a person who comes from there. where Chinese were actually testing their most modern submarines. And we were spying on it, but we never claimed that. And then when they shot our plane down, we said this was a recon plane. They chopped it up. President Bush had to try 5 calls to President Jiang Zemin at that time, over 3 days before the president was available, and they sent it back to us in pieces. Renminbi valuation, Alex has talked to you about. She's correct that by most estimates, the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, is undervalued by between 20 and 25%. And that obviously means that Chinese exports are cheaper, and that has been on the back of exports is how China has grown. And I'll come to China's economic side in a minute. But under Bush, you saw these problems and then sanctions on Iran that we are leading. This became a challenge for us because China went during that same period and signed a 30-year oil purchase agreement, but also is negotiating building a pipeline from there. So that our effort to financially and economically isolate Iran has become very difficult with this huge 30-year deal that China has already signed, and some other activities that they're doing in Africa that I'll skip now in the interest of time. Obama years. The civil nuclear agreement with India has been now formally done. The president might be in India in August or September, and you will see some final flourishes on that. High technology work is going on. The Indian Prime Minister was the first state visitor to the United States last year in November, and that joint statement highlights a number of areas of work, primarily in energy cooperation, high technology, and a whole range of economic value-added cooperation. India has played a bridge role in the Doha round, but not necessarily all positive, because India is also representing the developing bloc countries who are looking for more access to developed world markets in the US and EU. So India has a sort of schizoid or schizophrenic type of a job there. It's looking after the interests of its developed sectors, but also the developing sectors of India, as well as the developing world bloc that it represents. They're working, as I mentioned, in energy and in all of the non-proliferation areas. In fact, in 3 days' time, the Indian Prime Minister will be here. Next week, we have the Nuclear Security Summit of 43 heads of state, the NPT Review Conference, and other things. With China, as you see, the continuation of the economic engagement and the concept of G2, meaning US and China will work together for global financial and economic cooperation to create this kind of stability that we talked about. I think Alex's session talked a lot about the Chinese role in trying to shore up the global financial crisis. High-tech trade remains a major issue in US-China relationship. Iran, as I mentioned, and North Korea, and climate change as well. Now, what we have to come back, I think the China portion may be distracting you a little bit, so I'll focus a little more on the Indian economic program. What I've described so far is, under Clinton years in India-China relationship, a higher but additive relationship. We are building economic relationship, we are building some high-tech cooperation, but that's about it. Under Bush, you had a fundamentally different strategic calculation that India is a partner whose capabilities we need to assist in growing, and that will in turn help us build a partnership to achieve larger economic and security aims in the Asia Pacific and beyond. With the Obama team, there is a return to a democratic centrist type of an agenda. It's not backsliding to Clinton years. You are on that higher plane. But the strategic drivers of that cooperation are now not animated by, we need to actively build your capabilities and so on. But let's build these programs where the most momentum is on energy cooperation, nuclear and solar type of things. Some dialogue on high technology, and India becoming a center for technology benchmarking, low-cost technology benchmarking. And let me get to the economic side now, so this becomes clearer. Very quick snapshot of India's economic liberalization. You see a very hesitant start in the 80s under the new prime minister that we then had. And while protectionist forces in India mounted a campaign to block it, he did succeed in several things, and one of them was the birth of the IT revolution in India in the 80s. And we had an excess global supply of optic fiber cables. India chose wisely and invested in them, so massive laying of optic fiber cables, and that created the technical backbone for the start of the IT revolution. That has helped later on, as India is now working on biotech and other kinds of things, because when you look at, in this university especially, because I've looked at your departments and research profiles, when you look at high throughput research, genomic research, other kinds of things, if you did it the old way, farmers experimenting with crops, that used to take a very long time. But today you can take the fruits of what is available in the farms and bring it to a lab. And through the use of bioinformatics and a number of genetic manipulation, you can get to results very, very fast. And so that's happening in India in a major, major way. And I'll give you some numbers in the next slide of how far that is going. But anyway, to continue our story, India's IT revolution happens. And then in 1991, India has a balance of payment crisis. They have very little foreign reserves left, about $500 million. Today, just to give you a contrast, that number is about 145 billion. So they have considerably more foreign exchange now than they did then. That meant the dismantling of what I call the license Raj, or rule, which meant that what had happened in India, again in contrast to China, is from the 1950s and 60s, as the government invested heavily in the state-guided infrastructure building, providing of railways, power, heavy engineering, a very Soviet kind of a model of state-guided heavy engineering. From that, the government started giving more and more impetus to private sector growth. The private sector legally had equal rights, all the rights that any private sector here or elsewhere in the world has. But a few big actors quickly grew too big, and they came to the government and lobbied to keep the tariff walls very high in India. So say there is 300% tariff. You are in Germany, you produce a product at, say, 2 Deutsche Marks. Okay? With 300% tariff, which is 6 Deutsche Marks, it can only sell in the Indian market at 8 DMs. Right? So the Indian producer doesn't have to produce and match the 2 Deutsche Mark. So long as he can produce at a price less than 8, he can still sell in the Indian market cheaper than the German guy can. So it was in the economic interest of these domestic big producers to keep these walls high. And that had led to all kinds of protectionist policies favoring this kind of a system. But after the balance of payments crisis, the government said, enough with this. We have enough of private sector zeal and entrepreneurship. Let's just bring down these walls. So those walls are now down to 5%, in some cases 0%. And that's where the government, as a country, is going. It's already down, as I said, to about 5%, which is the same as ASEAN and China. And the effort is to get to about 0% in the next 10 years in a phased withdrawal. Now that meant that the Indian manufacturing sector, especially, suddenly faced this onslaught of foreign products. And they had to go through a very painful restructuring and drive up the efficiency. This was a very, very difficult phase in the 90s. You saw massive layoffs, massive retrenchment, and then the manufacturers coming up with better technology, cost-saving devices across the board. And then you started seeing the winners by the end of the 1990s. And I'll flag here the automakers, the auto components, the precision machinery, kinds of examples. Makers of Nano, the Tata car, which is about $2,500 for a car. You know, it's smaller than the Geo Metro. Lots and lots of examples. I'll provide some in my formal remarks, but much more in the Q&A. You also saw a surge in the Indian services sector. This has really grown tremendously over the last 20 years. And it has moved up the value chain from IT, which is just information technology, to IT-enabled services, to business process outsourcing. So Indian majors or US majors who are working together are now providing total product solutions or total technology solutions right there from India. Not just the guy with a fake Minnesota accent when you pick up the phone, you know, and talking about the weather with you, but people who are actually producing next generation technology jointly with US companies. And then finally into knowledge process outsourcing. They've actually started working together in creating next generation of products and technologies. It's a major, major surge and movement across the value chain in India. Agriculture, because it still comprises about 20% of the Indian economy and still employs about 64% people. Just to give you an idea, 30 years ago, 80% of the Indian population was engaged in agriculture. Okay. Today it's about 64%, and will drop to below 50% in the next 10 years or so. To give you a historical example, in the United States, between 1890 and 1900, about 60–70% people depended directly on agriculture. By 1940, that number was down to 3%, and about 18% were in the agri-business, food processing types of things. And that's where India is moving. Number of people employed in agricultural sector are coming away. There aren't enough jobs, and they're moving into food processing and so on. But many of the educated ones are actually farming out into the cities, not just the big tier 1 cities, but the tier 2 cities, satellite towns, and working there in technical jobs and so on. So that's where the Indian movement is, and the government is helping through different kinds of infrastructure support, fertilizers, genetically modified crops. There was a big debate in India, but finally they realized the value of it. So that's gone into production heavily. The NREGA is a remarkable, one of the world's biggest government security programs. It's called the National Rural Employment Generation Act. What it does is every household of 4 people below a certain income level will have at least one person guaranteed 100 days of good paying job. So at least that much will be the basis for you to live. And then, of course, you're free to do migrant work for the rest of the. These are ways for the government to sort of provide, this is not social security, but a sort of mini employment guarantee, and they're now scaling that up to provide it not only to the entire country, but raise that from 100 days to maybe 200 days down the road. The government's finances are in good shape because the country has been growing at about 8 to 9% for over a decade. Tax revenue has been doubling or growing at 25 to 30% each year, so the government has almost 3 times more in their budget today than they had 10 years ago. So there is more money to be spent on these kinds of things. Simple technology innovations like Simputer, not computer, but Simputer. Simputer is a handheld device with large keys and multilingual functionality. So even if you are not, literate in even if you only know regional languages, and India has 16 official languages and 500 unofficial languages. If you're a farmer, your challenge is I grow vegetables or milk. If I sell it in my immediate market, I get a very low price. I have 4 or 5 markets around me which will give me better price, but I don't know which one to go to. Do they need it? Do they have trucks that will take them to cities? How do I get that information? The Simputer costs $220, which is an investment, but you can get bank loans to do that. And on that device, each day, you will get a price for all the regional markets around you. And then you can decide to put your stuff on a truck, which will take you from your market down the road onto that market and sell it, and you get the product price for it and so on. So these kinds of innovations are happening in India, which are reviving. And then they are making a big push in moving away from subsistence farming to a lot of contract farming. So big potato chips, manufacturers to others are growing, or Italians are growing Italian tomatoes in India under contract farming. And from there, they ship it back either to Italy or in India or the rest of the world. So contract farming is happening, and they're moving toward cash crops. So you have better profit margins and so on. Anyway. Some more things. Individual states in a federal system like India with 26 states are now becoming active stakeholders in the growth process in multiple ways. Greater share of exports. More importantly, the criteria for federal disbursement is not only need-based, but performance-based. Better performing states need to be rewarded for it, and so that's happening now. The consumer profile in India, I've thrown some numbers there to give you an idea. 100 million of the Indians would be considered by international standards to be rich. About 450 million in the Indian middle class, maybe 200 million of them are in international lower middle class. 500 million are still poor. Now, all of them are not starving because the prices and cost of living in India is far lower. But the really poor people are probably 200 to 250 million, and that's still a major, major problem, and that's like 60% of this country's population. But we are still talking about 75% of people who are better off today and getting better. Urban-rural divide is another major issue. In India, the number of urban sectors is growing, so about 55, you see 35 to 40% of India is now urban. The rural sector is important because they are the ones where a lot of disposable cash is, and they want to partner and emulate in some ways their urban folks. So when you look at the sale of retail items today, refrigerators, FMCGs, the fast-moving consumer goods, tractors, motorcycles, cars, 70% of the market is in rural India now. Small examples, Unilever used to sell these lovely, big shampoo bottles. And they realized that in the villages, these women don't have use for that or sometimes cannot even afford that. So they came up with a sachet model, like the ketchup that we get or fire sauce in Taco Bell, use and throw one sachet. Now that costs 1 rupee, just a few cents, one use. And suddenly the market exploded, because women would say, yeah, on special occasions I need to use shampoo. So catering to the domestic market and its buying power and changing that has driven the demand in the rural sector, and that's pioneered a lot of the Indian growth. So India is growing in the villages and in other places. Now I mentioned to you the Indian private sector, that it had equal rights from the 50s and 60s. In China, by example, by contrast, it was only in 1991 that the Chinese private sector companies were allowed on an equal legal footing with public sector companies in China. And it was only by 1997 that these Chinese companies could actually acquire capital or set up a business abroad, borrow technology and capital from abroad. And that's why you heard Alex mention that 10 years ago she found out that 50% of exports from China were foreign companies exporting from China. 20 years ago it was 80%. But now Chinese companies are growing. But because the private sector is relatively nascent and newer in China, you still have them going through their own paces. But in India, on the other hand, because they always existed and now the government controls have gone, these companies over the last 20 years have just surged. And so they are acquiring property abroad, they're setting up joint ventures, they're going into all manner of business, and across the board, they're all into value addition, which is where I'm now coming. Last couple of points before I get to that. India is also picking up and doing more with what China has done very successfully, and that is to create the special economic zones and export processing zones, export-focused areas. Trade and investment has now become very central to India's foreign policy negotiations. This was not the case 20 years ago, but now I talk to an ambassador in Germany and he'll tell me proudly within the first 3 minutes, we got the phytosanitary standards approved and mangoes and others are now selling in the German market, same in the US and so on. US inspectors, in other words, will be sitting on those ports and inspecting and packaging those items, but they're now allowed into this market. So foreign policy negotiations. Similarly, I was in Singapore for some of my CSCAP work. We had just finished getting the ASEAN countries to agree to 26 benchmarks. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Countries or nations. And we got them to adopt these benchmarks, and next day from Manila, I go to Singapore, sorry. And the Indian Commerce Minister is there, and they had just negotiated that day a free trade area between India and ASEAN countries. I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister and I asked him how does he feel about engaging India more closely, because they were very heavily reliant on China. And he smiles and cryptically tells me, it's always good to stand on 2 legs than just 1 leg. So India is expanding its trading relationship with the Southeast Asia. India's largest trading partner is the European Union as a bloc. But United States, India, which I come to next slide, their growth has catapulted, and so has India's own economic engagement with China. All right. One last bit, and I hope I'm not sounding too scattered. Technology-intensive growth model. I wanted to stress this, because India, much like China, is facing a situation which is, right now, they never had a one-child or population control policy. It's been more democratic. They've recommended 2 children. And these days, you look at an average Indian family, and it is 2 children or even less in the cities now. But as an average, 2.3 children. They're bringing it down. India still has a far greater employment problem that it will face 20, 30 years. But right now they're in a sweet spot where they have a young population, very young population. So 10 to 12 million of them enter the workforce every year, and the government is concerned about it. So what it's doing is it's manipulating the factors of production so that with that same technology, I can bring in more people, labor force, into my production model. So I solve my unemployment problem even as I move up the value chain of production. You see what I'm saying? And to give you an example of how this works is that Intel is designing its next generation chip through which it will make well over $50 billion money in the next 20 years. It's designing it in India, in Bangalore. But the serial production of that same chip will be in Shanghai, because Shanghai is much better at mass production and infrastructure. Same with General Electric. Technology in aviation that they're producing out of Bangalore at the R&D facility will be mass manufactured out of their Shanghai Technology Center. So that's sort of the US-India. A couple of lines on this. Would I have 8, 10 minutes? Not? Yeah. I think I'm okay. India and China have regularly been invited for the last 5 years, and they have been attending the G8. The G8 is the top economic countries in the world. China and India have an improved and growing role in that. Also in the G20, which is a group of developed and developing economies, where these two are formally members, and their role is growing there, as well as in the WTO that I mentioned. US-India trade, look at those figures. Trade in goods is now 45 billion. This year will cross 52 billion. Trade in services is about 32 billion and also growing. CAGR is, for any of you economists, cumulative average growth rate, or compounded annual growth rate. So you see these numbers, and to give you a contrast, the US-China trade is roughly 220 billion. So India is not in the top tier of US trading, but in the second tier. The tier one are Mexico, Canada, Japan, and China, roughly in the 200 billion range. The next ones are about 50 billion or so, and that's where India is, and moving quite fast at 25-30% growth. Intra-multinational corporation trade, meaning foreign companies of US investing in India and vice versa, Indians investing in the US companies. That trade since 2002 was 30 billion. That's a staggering number. It's a very high number. So that shows you how well the corporations are working together and how much they're investing in capacity addition in each other's economies. Another statistic, India's direct investment into the US market now is higher in the last 3 years than US investment in India. Okay. Another factor that gives you an idea of how engaged they are becoming. Outsourcing. You heard Alex mention the McKinsey, and President Obama, when a candidate, was saying when he'll become president, he will stop all federal grants to companies that were engaged in outsourcing. Now let me give you two statistics. McKinsey did a study which said that for every dollar that the United States economy outsources to India, $47 comes back to the US economy. So we need to remember these figures in terms of what it's doing to the US economy. And I asked the General Electric, with whom I serve as an advisor to GE, and I asked them what would happen if that. They said, look, first of all, my share of my revenue from government contracts is less than 2%, so I don't care really if they'll stop those contracts. But the second thing is, if they do that, I will move my legal and financial capitals to the Cayman Islands tomorrow. I'll still work in the US, but I'll just be a Cayman Island-owned company. Now, why are they saying all of this? And why did President Obama not move forward on that? The reason is companies don't belong to a country. They really are in search of cheapest rate at which I can get capital and technology and infrastructure to produce some items with a healthy profit margin. If I don't get it here because wages are too high, and you heard Alex give some numbers, I can give the same numbers for India, multiple times cheaper than producing here. A comparable job in the Silicon Valley or Seattle or even here for, say, a white-collar worker in the technology sector is, say, $75,000 here. You can get that same caliber, if not higher, job in India for $15,000 to $20,000. Right? So corporations are in search of what in economics we call product cycle theory. I will move from here to here to here. And even on outsourcing, by the way, when you start doing well, your own people start making more money. So when India started with the outsourcing in the IT sector and the wages started rising, India was not the most competitive. So you know, the story of outsourcing, India would take US outsourced jobs and outsource them to Philippines and Vietnam, get it done cheaper there, bring it back to India, assemble it, send it back to the US. And in 10 years, Philippines and Vietnam prices will grow enough wages, and they will then outsource it to Suriname and Papua New Guinea, and this is how the world moves. So there's nothing, you do not control these things. They move with prices and combination of factors. All right, I'll skip energy, cooperation, climate change, except to say that the US and India are working fairly closely together in those things. Biotech pharma, I should mention one point here, and that is FDA-approved clinical trials are happening in India in a big way, last 10 years, 5 years especially. Because you can, first of all, many of the diseases in plant, animal, and humans that we have eradicated in this country still exist in India. So A, you have a wide germ pool that you can work on, and B, it's easier to get test subjects in India. So within FDA approvals, you conduct these trials, and you generate treatment and come out with drugs that are either generic drugs, bulk drugs, or even branded drugs, and sell them in India, but also sell them back in the US and sell them in the rest of the world. And that has meant that biotech and pharma cooperation between US and India has just zoomed. It's growing at well over 100% each year. So India's biotech exports grew from nothing to 6 billion and will cross 20 billion in about 4 years' time. I mean, that's the kind of growth we're talking about here. And massive research and R&D opportunities for bilateral work. Low-cost center for technology benchmarking. NASA, right here, is working with ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization in Bangalore, on remote sensing and low-cost technology benchmarking in satellite launches. Because India is the world's 6th largest satellite producer and launcher, and launches it at about 12% of the cost of NASA's launch. Okay. So is China doing that, by the way? Anyway. Last, closing two sets of remarks. India-China profile I had mentioned to you. Bilateral trade in goods, 52 billion. India's largest trading partner is China, overtaking the US 2 years ago. But both are growing at about 30% or so. Irrational exuberance over trade surplus, meaning India was exporting more to China. But when you look below those numbers, India was actually exporting more of raw materials to China. And in many ways was becoming, like many other Southeast Asian companies, a supplier of semi-finished products to China, and China was becoming the region's, and later over time, really the world's global manufacturing hub. So India is yet another thing. And what China has done very strategically is it has allowed these smaller developing countries to have a trade surplus with China, and China's own trade surplus is with the big ones, Japan, EU, and the United States, the biggest one. That's why China has now become the world's largest foreign trader, meaning exports plus imports, ahead of Germany, which is number 2, and the US, which is number 3 now. And it exports about 1.2 trillion, imports about 1.1 trillion. So it has a net trade surplus, but the bulk of that surplus comes from its huge surplus with EU, Japan, and the US. And that allows it to have trade deficit to stimulate more trading relationship with these countries. They also have open arms policy toward the Indian IT people, because China is very strong on the hardware side, India is strong on the software side, so they're soaking up as much of Indian IT software as they can. China line of products, not just the China price. You go to India and you'll see these products which are 30% cheaper than the Indian products. And they say, oh, these are Chinese products. If you are buying them, then you buy them for gifts, or if you don't, because they may not have the best quality or best servicing and so on. So they say you can buy this for your own house, or if you're going to give a gift, it's a very shiny, nice product, you can buy the China price items. But I will come back to Alex's point, which is that China is also, just as India is moving up the value chain, China is investing massively in improving those things and trying to create a much better image for itself, because the consequences of making a mistake by having metal in toys or arsenic or other kinds of things in milk and other kinds of things, that's costing Beijing a lot, both money and branding problems. So they're moving in that, but That's a problem that is also true in China's economic trade with India, and that's why a lot of litigation and suits filed by India in the WTO. I'll skip the rest and come to the last concluding point. And this is back to our US-India engagement. One reason why, looking forward, you see with the Obama team and beyond, is that the US and India are fundamentally aligned in terms of their worldviews, democracy, rule of law, emphasis on knowledge-intensive growth, dispute settlement mechanisms, security, worldview. I mean, there are differences in the region about how to deal with Pakistan, how to deal with certain challenges in Afghanistan, but very close cooperation on counterterrorism and across the board in knowledge creation, benchmarking, and all of that. So I see that trend line to continue to accelerate and move upward. But the problem is in trying to make the partnership work on the ground. Both these countries have treated themselves as exceptional countries. So I'll follow the rules up to a point, and after that, you really know that my credentials allow me a little bit of. And for India, it's a problem because it's a transitional state in the Indian international system. It's not a big power yet. It'll get there maybe in 10 years, but it's not there yet. It also sometimes acts like a trade union leader. We are representative of the non-aligned movement or the developing bloc with a bullhorn like an AFL-CIO person. But you really want a seat at the business table. You can't do both. You have to make up your mind. So you will see India in sectors where it is lagging and the developing economies still represent a lot of developmental issues that are north-south type of issues. But on developed sectors, you see US and India dealing on a north-north issues. A lot of cooperation happening there. And sometimes Washington has offered very binary choices. Well, make up your mind, you're with us or against us. And that creates problems dealing with Iraq or voting with the US on Iran or issues like that, although India has supported and consistently voted with the US on Iran. Bureaucratic inertia. The pro-engagement guys are always the ones with their heads on the chopping block. If cooperation doesn't happen on the ground, then quickly the naysayers will say, aha, I told you, it's very difficult to work with these guys. These pesky Indians are not easy to work with. But because you have cooperation happening on the ground, those models are becoming the models of success that are beginning to replicate. And the government is providing a facilitating framework for all kinds of growth, not just in the economic, but also on the security side. I'll close by just saying 2 lines. One is, these are paradigm shifting agreements. You are changing how we engaged with India for the last 40 years. We are now treating it as one of the emerging world powers. Making this cooperation happen and changing the way the bureaucracies work, the government works, the corporations work. Although at the corporate and people-to-people level, it's very, very easy to work because they work very similarly. But making this happen just will take time. So you'll see still some of this transition play out over the next 10, 15 years. The last point I'll make is, and this is true for both Washington and for Beijing, Washington and for Delhi, is how to deal with China. And the fundamental fault line is China's growing sphere of influence, of soft power and hard power in the Asia-Pacific and internationally. What are going to be the lines of relative spheres of influence between India and China within Asia, and US spheres of influence in Asia versus China's? China's rising sphere of influence is creating these fault lines, and how we manage in economic and security areas the management of these divisions or spheres of influence is the major challenge for the next 20 years for all of us. And while Beijing is playing a very smart strategic game, as you heard from Alex, it's not a monolithic actor. There are several divisions within China. And so dealing with a rising power, Haping Jueqi, and peaceful rise of China type of things, will create fault lines, and we'll all have to manage, but we have so much invested by all these actors, not just India, but Japan, Russia, and others, that trying to create positive economic and security outcomes with Beijing is the only feasible answer. Everything else is a very adverse outcome that these countries will try to avoid to the best of their costs. The question is, where will this loose equilibrium ultimately reside, and will it change with the changing relative capabilities of these countries? And that's the real challenge for us over the next 20 years. Thank you for your patience, and I'll take what questions you may have.
General Motors today. We have many other, but you understand?
I do. Big corporations look after their profits and they secure political interests for preferential rates when they invest in different countries, whether it's South America or United Foods. I can give you examples from around the world. What China is doing is it's following a sort of neoclassical mercantilist type of an approach. You can look at that from Bismarck's Germany onwards, or you can look at US approach, or UK before that, of securing these sources of supply of raw materials, oil to gas to minerals from Sudan and Angola to other places. And it's pumping in so much money there without bothering about the human rights and other issues. When you in fact talk from Washington to Beijing, they say, look, you impose sanctions and you cut off even what little relationship and effect you had on those countries. I am actually giving them a chance through economic growth so that they grow and they become stakeholders in the international economy. And if you don't have poverty, then it also diffuses or reduces the chance of the poor people being drawn into terrorist and other kind of extremist ideas. Now, that sounds like a very smart statement because it is a PR statement, because only part of it is true. What China is also doing is it's become the biggest supplier of illegal guns and small arms across Africa and Latin America. It's also forced its own traders and others into very preferential relationship with these governments and these economies. So when you talk to Africa, they're not happy with what China is doing. But it is following a model that's been followed before. Now, what it's doing is it's powering China's industrial growth, but the net impact of that, as you heard from Alex also in the morning, is big pollution challenges and other things. But China says we cannot afford to look at those moral issues right now. We have to grow. For Beijing, for a one-party rule, sustained economic growth is a source for the legitimacy of the one-party rule. So they will do everything within their power. Wen Jiabao, the premier, had said 4 years ago that we are going to look at soft landing of 5 to 7% because we are now hitting inflation. So inflation will eat away our real gains. They had to put that off for 2-3 years because of the economic downturn, and the fiscal stimulus that they provided was very, very large, larger than we did per capita in the US. So China is growing again, but massive income inequality. You heard about labor shortages in the South. That's happening because China has strict controls over population flows. So people from the West cannot actually all come very easily and get documents and papers and work in the South. So China is taking and driving foreign investment westward to say, invest it here and we'll grow that economy. Don't grow everything here. Now, so China is battling economic inequality, pollution kinds of problems, and it's aware of it, and it's trying to do, as you heard Alex talk about, the coal mines and so on. But it's a massive, gigantic scale problem, and it won't be able to solve it anytime soon. In India, you have slightly better situation in these things, but you still have the problems of managing poverty and distribution, or managing growth versus distribution, growth versus environment, and those issues. And they will keep walking these tightrope walks. In India, the difference is that you can influence the levers of government policy, because you deal with them and it's transparent and there is a democratic process. In China, you're not always successful. And that makes it harder for US companies and even the government to influence renminbi valuation to other kinds of things.
Can you estimate what percentage their military budget is, and going forward with that percentage being tend to increase or decrease?
I'll tell you exactly what it is. It's averaged about 2.1% over the last 20 years, and it's going to remain. There is a law in the Indian Parliament that it will never exceed 3%. And the government says that it's already large enough. If the economy keeps growing at 7-8%, then a 2 to 3% growth is sufficient for military modernization, and that's where it'll be.
Is that an indicator that there is more confidence, there may be more confidence on the part of American or foreign companies in the technical abilities available in India as opposed to China?
Here is a quick way to peel back and look at this problem. In the early 1990s, US and European companies invested massively in China. Okay? The government law in China was that you are required to have a local partner, so you had joint ventures. The JB laws said that all decisions will be made jointly, and that's where the Chinese laws and Chinese companies asserted that they'll have a certain intellectual property right agreement in place and so on. What really happened is that by 95, 96, a lot of American and EU technology created in a company where Chinese workforce was trained, These guys would learn, work in the shop for 6 months to a year, and then walk down the street and open another company with that same patented technology. So IPR was a huge problem, and the people started bleeding and losing money. So they started throwing money, good money, into China to recover money gone bad. By 2001, it had grown to an extent that the foreign companies began to withhold investment, further investment into China. The government finally got a message, and they created what are now called wholly foreign-owned enterprises. So you have more control over what's happening. And that has led to a revival of foreign investment in China. But during this difficult phase, they realized that with India, we never had a problem of skill sets. And now that the government has opened up its sectors of investment, 100% in most cases, or 75% and so on, and the workforce is fairly global, comfortable with English language, having studied in Western institutions or educational institutions and so on, and wages being 1/5 maybe of what it is in the US. That if we can bring a technology and create our own power backup systems, electricity, create our own buildings, water, all of that, then you create a little mini colony of your own that you can control, because the workforce is top caliber, as I said. And that's why you saw the mushrooming of these technology centers in India. And that fitted in very well with the Indian government's technology-intensive, knowledge-intensive growth model. So the government subsidy, incentives, and so on. And that has become really the pioneer of why you see technology coming out of India.
Japanese and other local Asian countries and the European country brands, but the American brands don't seem to be doing really well in the consumer market.
You do see American products, you just see American products in the higher price range, higher technology range. If you ask a major Indian factory producer, who do you buy your technology platform from? They'll probably say the US, or if we don't get that technology, we'll go to Japan or Germany. The products you're talking about where the Koreans and others are flooding the Indian market are in refrigerators, washing machines, those areas. Right? Where the Indian products are also in the market. Godrej is just as successful as Haier from China or LG from ROK, from South Korea. So urban and rural middle market is where the Koreans have targeted, some of their cars, electronic products. So are the Chinese now making a larger push and so on. But the Indian products are holding their own. It's just a massive market, so there is scope for all of them. On the higher end, you will still see German, Italian, to an extent French, but less so, Japanese, and a very wide US presence in that market. And that will remain. In fact, that's where most of the Indian big producers are also partnering with US technology producers to create models and products for the global market. And that's where most of my work in promoting US-India high technology trade with the two governments comes in. And we have worked to end this. Let me put it this way, 99.1% of all license applications from India to the US for high technology are now approved. We're dealing with 0.9%. And even that, we are trying to create better licensing conditions to make that happen. And you'll see more and more of that happening.